Today, for this third episode of the AI Impact podcast, we have the chance to have Eric Klopfer with us. He's a professor at MIT specialized in pedagogy and technology, and of course, he's very interested and working on the impact of generative AI, LLMs, ChatGPT on learning and teaching. Many things in this discussion blew my mind and actually were very useful and affected the way I see generative AI as a tool to help or harm learning. We'll start the podcast by discussing the result of an experience Eric made with his students, revealing that the faster AI was able to help solve tasks, the lower the learning for students. These results went across the globe very quickly. I made a post on LinkedIn and it reached about 500,000 people, got 300 reposts, hundreds of comments. It intrigued, triggered, worried, interested many people. So let's dive into this experience and discuss the AI impact on learning. Let's start directly with this fascinating experiment you have done, and that's intrigued, to say the least, many people. It shows the more powerful the AI, or the less the capacity to learn in this experiment. Tell us more what happened and what was so striking about these results.
Yeah, so first I want to qualify that it was a classroom experiment that we did. So this is not a scientific study at this point, although we're working on sort of turning this into that right now, and we hope that in the next year we'll be able to replicate the example. The outcomes, of course, could change, but we hope to replicate the methodology that we've set up forth here. But I think it's a powerful illustrative example of some of the sort of both strengths and weaknesses of AI and the way we think about it intersecting with learning. So I was teaching a course on teaching computer science. So it's for students who are interested in teaching computer science, primarily at the pre-college level. And so in our unit on AI, we did a little experiment. And in that unit, so we had about 15 people in the class, and we broke the students up into three different groups. In the first stage, they all had a programming assignment. In that stage, they were told to sort of make a simple program. It was, the typical, I think in this case, it was like convert Fahrenheit to Celsius and ask for an input and give an output and format it and those sorts of things. And all the students probably could have done that in some programming language with ease. I chose the programming language Fortran, which is a language that none of them knew, and most of them hadn't really even heard of before. It happened to be one that I used in grad school many years ago. But it's a little bit of an esoteric language. It's not just sort of a simply syntactical change from languages they might be familiar with. There's some fundamental differences. So I chose that for that reason because there was some learning to be associated with that process. And so the three different groups that I structured were one group that used ChatGPT in this stage to be able to help solve the problem. Another group that used what's called Code Llama. It's Meta's open source. At the time, it was Meta's open source model for coding that you could run locally. And then the last group was told that they couldn't use any AI. They could only use just web search to be able to help solve this problem. And they all knew that after this first stage where they were meant to solve this problem, they were told that they would have a test afterwards, and that test would be closed book. So they needed to learn enough in this first stage to answer a very similar problem in the second stage. So they spent some time doing this. Very quickly, the first group that was using ChatGPT had a correct answer to the problem. It took quite a bit longer for the Code Llama group, but eventually they got the answer as well. And then the longest group was the Google group. It took them a while to search and piece together the right answer to this problem. But they all were eventually able to be successful. It was just a matter of the time it took to be able to get to that answer. Then they studied for a little bit. Studied their answers, and then they were given their closed book test. I can't remember what the second problem was, but it was a similar kind of problem where it was asking for inputs. There was some sort of conversion in between or some sort of manipulation of the data, and then there was some sort of output on the other side. Sure enough, none of the people who had used ChatGPT could solve the problem correctly. About half the students who had done the Code Llama one could solve it correctly, and all four of the students who are in this web search group could solve the problem correctly. And it's this idea that there's learning, we sometimes we call it friction. So like learning that has some friction is actually more effective than learning that has no friction. And it may seem counterintuitive to students. It seems like, particularly I think with the facility not only of AI, but of sort of the ready access to information that students have become accustomed to through the internet, through modern technology and smartphones, it feels like I should be able to get the answer quickly to everything. But in fact, there is productive struggle. There's a sense that like when I struggle with problems to at least to some extent, it's more successful. Yeah, I think we can relate this back to there's a famous learning theory from Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development. And it's this idea that we learn best not when problems are too easy for us or too hard for us, but we're in that sort of middle just right zone, the Goldilocks zone of problems. And in that zone, we struggle a little bit. We struggle, we can solve problems, but only with some help. So sometimes that help is from a peer, a mentor, a teacher, even like a constructive problem that I'm working on. But that's the place where we learn the most. And I think that like most people don't appreciate that sort of like that idea that like I should struggle a little bit. It actually will be more helpful in the long run. I'll be able to better understand things if I can spend some time, um, you know, in the weeds, in the mud, sort of like working a little bit hard on this problem. And I think that's a big challenge that we're facing with AI at this point is how to create
Mhm.
environments that don't frustrate people because you don't want it to be too hard. But at the same point, don't deliver answers too quickly to people because it's not going to be the thing that gives them the best outcomes in the long run. I'll say it's a little bit different than if I'm just using AI to solve a problem. So, like I was introducing vibe coding to people in my lab. Vibe coding is this idea that, like I can go to an AI a bot and type in a prompt for an app, and it will sort of create a whole app for me. And sometimes for some people, it's just like, I just need that app. I don't care how it works. I'm not going to do the same thing again. I just want like, I wanted a little thing so that like, uh, example in my lab was someone was like, I want a little thing that's a little calendar and I can sort of like show it like what I spent my time on and it will help me sort of track like where I spent work, where I spent,
Mhm.
exercising. You know, I was able to sort of create that app in like 3 minutes pretty well. And it was like it didn't need to be distributed to other people. A person didn't need to sell it. Like they just wanted like a little thing to help them keep track of their time. Perfect. Like they don't need to know how it works. So it's different to think about like AI to like help me create something where I'm like, I just care about the output. I just care about this thing that it's going to create. And AI where it's trying to help me through a process where I'm trying to learn something and get through it and come out with some learning outcome on the other side.
Mhm. So I have many follow-up questions. The
Yeah.
first will be very, very simple. I'm just curious, what was the different time, the duration and the difference between the group to solve the issue? Solve the first like coding task in Fortran.
Yeah, so I have to remember. I think it was probably the whole first phase was probably 25 minutes or something like that, 30 minutes. So probably the ChatGPT group probably got it in like 5 to 10 minutes. And so they were sitting around for a while like studying because they had the extra time. And the Google group probably took probably close to half an hour to solve the problem, and it was the other group was probably somewhere in between.
Okay. But I'm actually very surprised that they knew that they would get a follow-up test and that still the group who got the answers failed, right?
Yes.
Did I understood correctly? Because
That is
this really,
correct. They knew they were going to have a test. They knew that they had to study this. They knew they had to understand it. It wasn't just a matter of them, like I described the other problem. It's not just a matter of like, I need to solve this problem and move on. I need to solve this problem and learn how it works so I can solve a similar problem. They knew that.
wow. So it really reflects because I got basically, and I'm sure we'll get in this direction in a minute, but how to basically, it's not a matter of AI. That was the main discussion in the post I've made about your experiment, where I got about 300 comments, something like this, and many of these comments were like, well, it's not AI, it's how you use it. But here, also something that I answered often is that we as humans are not rational. And there's an issue here because if it's cheap, we might use it and use it in a suboptimal way for learning, not for solving the task in time wise, but to learn. And here, the fact that they knew actually highlight that these shortcuts were made and prevented to learn, and they could not efficiently replace this issue. So basically, it leads, and I guess maybe you want to react to that and also add, because you mentioned this terminology of friction in learning. And
Yep.
do you have maybe a way to connect the two and also show how friction in learning, other examples beyond this one, for example, common example that you usually use?
Yeah, I mean, so I just want to say your point about they understood this was an assessment, and that there would be another assessment and that they needed to learn on the other side. I think this is actually happens a lot in certainly in university learning and I think to some extent in K-12 learning as well. Some of that happens because we don't convey to students the importance of assessments. They feel like it's just a thing to get a grade so that the person knows how I'm doing, as opposed to that's part of the learning experience, so I can get feedback, I can understand how I'm doing. And we saw this very quickly with writing and AI. I think even more before we saw coding, like it was like the student who would go to ChatGPT to write the paper for them, um, and um, and without understanding like why like the purpose of this course is so that I can do writing, so I can process my thoughts, so that I can understand things better. Giving that prompt to ChatGPT is really it's shortcutting my learning process. It's not about it's not about my internalization of the content, or sort of processing it with my own unique perspective on it. It's about sort of getting something that someone else will give me a check mark on or a grade on. So I think there's some sort of like disconnect between students and instructors on the meaningfulness of assessment. And I think that's created this sort of like rapid cycle of trying to shortcut that, and it's shortcutting learning. In this case, though, they knew that was going to be the purpose. They knew the purpose was to get to the other side, and it still was a problem. I think it's easy to see this like in math. The idea of this kind of friction. If it's a I could I if I'm doing arithmetic and I'm plugging all my problems into a calculator, I'm not understanding any math sense from that. I'm going to come out the other side, and I'm going to be able to be when you take the calculator away from me, I'm really not going to be able to solve those problems because I've sort of come up with all the answers very quickly. That's a trivial example, but it's like that shows like it's an easy one to understand as well. Like, yeah, like if I want to understand my multiplication tables, like I actually have to go through the work of like sitting down and trying to practice them. And we could say like, hey, in the day of when computers are at our fingertips and smartphones are in our pockets, why would I possibly need to know that? But we all know there's examples where like doing that, being able to sort of have that mathematical sense of multiplication tables to do an application on the spot, whether it's at the store or in my workplace, or calculations for measurements, like all those kinds of things, to have some sense of what those numbers are is really, really important. And if we shortcut that process, imagine now that was just with mathematics and calculators. I do. Some people debate the sort of analogy between AI and calculators. I actually think it's a pretty good one. Um, but now we have the calculator for writing. We have the calculator for coding. We have the calculator for just about everything. And if we apply it everywhere without thinking about it, we're really going to be in that same situation. We're not going to have that sort of number sense. We're not going to have a code sense. We're not going to have a writing sense, a communication sense. It's really shortcutting all of our learning processes there.
Yeah, exactly. I think I actually wrote exactly this point about calculator because it has been brought so many times. Like, we can still go on with our lives. Yeah, but here it's way to a completely different scale, how you just really well framed. It's a general purpose technology. So
Yep.
it's affecting this small, not just this small, which is not that small at all, actually, arithmetic computation, but many aspects of our lives. And it's really a question. I mean, the two first episodes were about independent thinking and how it killed the debate in some class where a professor basically gave a case studies. And for the last 10 years, he shared the case studies where students, business case, had to choose between A and B. And there were always a debate for the last 10 years. This year, he asked the same question, two different classes from people around the world. They all answered A. everybody in the two classes. He asked who used ChatGPT. Everybody raised, 90% of the class raised their hands. It completely killed the debate. And then basically we were discussing, and it's connected to this discussion, that when you are out in the wild and you are discussing on the job during an interview, well, you want to be able to come up with these answers. And also, with the example of the debate where everybody chose A, in this case, maybe both were good choices. But now you just have people who are just framed to think standardized with one way of thinking, one solution. You think that it's the right one. But here, there was no ground truth. There was what the company actually did. It was an example with LinkedIn. But it was not necessarily the ground truth. What they did maybe was not the best choice. We don't know because we don't have the basically the alternative.
I think
Um,
that's a really I think it's a really important point because I think that AI has a potential to homogenize thought, particularly as you think about, a lot of AI models are trained on AI models,
mhm,
and so we get this circular process where we're going to get like homogenization of thought, and there's some politicization of that kind of thing, which I think is unwarranted. But I do think that these kind of tools, if they're meant to be helping us think, they shouldn't be sort of giving everybody the same answer. And people should know how to interpret that so that they can understand, like, oh, this is essentially one system's opinion. And I need to sort of take my own insights and sort of integrate that with that thought and not just sort of take it at its face value.
mhm. And also, there is this aspect of your example with vibe coding here was very interesting because indeed, in the setup you showed, well, basically the person might not be able to do it otherwise, or at least on the short run. Maybe he would have to learn it, but it was not worth it. So basically, in this other situation without an AI, he would probably never have done it. So in this situation, maybe arguably it was useful, but also you have this tension and also with learning between short and long run effects. And I have a very good example that might speak to you because I started coding when I was maybe 11 years old with C Sharp, C++, and then a lot of PHP and all this JavaScript. Then Stata as a young researcher, R
Huh?
and MATLAB. And now I really struggle to learn Python because most of the time I'm coding in Google Colab, where basically before I just start writing, I got the full code already written due
Yep.
to all the Gemini automatization. And just how to select subpart of a panda, I sometimes struggle to remember and to be sure because I don't do it. So while it's faster the first time, it's not on the long run actually. Because
Yep.
every time I have to double check and to maybe ask again the LLM. While if I struggled with this friction, I really like this framing. It- just one day maybe. For the next few years, 10 years, maybe my whole rest of the career, if I still code in Python, I would just go it directly and remember
Yep.
from the top of my mind. And sometimes people just say, well, you don't need to know things by heart. Yes, you do. If you want to go far in a field, you have to have actually a mass of things that you know by heart. If I
Yep.
think about statistics, if I want to question a model, I have like just a gazillion, tons of things that I have to have in my mind because I cannot double check all these assumptions. And I have to know that you have this assumption and what are the implications. So you cannot reread all the books every time you want to answer. So yes, having things by heart is very important for learning and applying the knowledge.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think there's
yes.
a couple, and so there's different kinds of other research that's going on in this space. I saw one study though where uh, students who were given sort of the pedagogical model, so like people are training some like LLMs to sort of be more uh, pedagogically minded when they give advice. So rather than sort of giving an answer, it sort of helps someone through a
Hmm.
process. But students don't like that necessarily. They want the answer. And so they will either try to shortcut that or they'll discard the one that they're given in favor of a commercial off the shelf one to sort of get the answer more quickly. There's one of my colleagues has a grad student who's currently working on some reinforcement learning models where um, the idea is to sort of have a model sort of learn when it should be more direct to the student and help them quickly to get to an answer, and when it should be more Socratic and help them sort of like provide some of that friction. And that's not it's not just sort of a universal truth about when you should do that. It has to do with, a student's attention. It might have to do with with what sort of background they have. It might have to do with their mindset that they have. It might have to do with what they had for breakfast that day. So I think it's important to think about some of these systems that can be sort of attuned to when students might be disengaging from the system, trying to sort of go around it or getting disaffected by it, and when they can sort of be challenged, when you can add that friction productively, and when that friction might become sort of a barrier to them.
So why would it be a barrier? For example, do you have a...
So someone might decide like I'm done with this. Like
Ah, okay.
I'm just gonna I'm either gonna stop doing this because it's too hard for me. It might be that I don't have the time right now, and I'm gonna just sort of get a quick answer from another system and drop out. It might be I'm gonna copy something from someone else. Like there's different reasons why I might sort of decide, okay, in this particular case, I might be more direct in my answer to this person to sort of keep them engaged to get them to that next step so that I can give them some of that friction later on.
Okay, I see. So you already more or less outlined this, but indeed many people said it was or discussed, and I still had this in mind actually. Also coming to this discussion, that it's a big part is about how we use AI, and you were already brought two different pieces of evidence that it's more complex than this. First, we might still want the shortcuts. We have seen this in your sure. Let's still remind it's not yet a scientific experiment, but it's still some experiment with at least anecdotal strong evidence to show that even if they knew that they could prepare for the test, it was destructive for the learning. And here I also find very interesting what you said, because I was, for example, following the Coursera class by Ethan Molik about how to build these tutor chatbots, and
Uh-huh.
was quite enthusiastic. And actually, I do this for my classes. I try to instruct this model with a system prompt to behave basically more like tutors. And what you're
Mhm.
saying here is that people might realize this, students might realize this quickly and turn to another tool.
Right.
Uh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a study, it was just earlier this year. It was in mathematics, where that happened. But they found that students would sometimes either shortcut the system or move to a different system in order to get the answers more quickly.
Mm. What do you think about using Gen AI to also limit, or can we use Gen AI to improve learning?
I think so, yes. I do think we have to think about questions like we're talking about, like when does it give, when is it Socratic, when is it direct? Even within, even for particular students, like we're working on a model that works not with one student but with groups of students. So the idea is students are working together on a project, and the AI agent is basically helping them work with each other. So rather than sort of giving answers to a single person, it's helping a group of people work together. Um, and in that case, one of the things we try to do is think about like when is it okay for our agent to actually just answer a question? So, for example, if they're working on a math project, and they need to do something in Excel, and to like, we don't actually care if they learn Excel, we care if they
Mm,
learn math.
mhm,
So, if they ask a question about Excel, like it should give them a direct answer about how to do that thing in Excel. It shouldn't be Socratic about helping them figure that out. Just tell them how to do it in Excel. Um, it might be about like how do I understand the graph? I don't care about like how do I actually build the graph in Excel. I just want to see the graph. So in these cases, I think that it can be really helpful for them to be, asking this thing direct feedback so they can actually, the teacher doesn't need to be answering that question about how to do that in Excel. The students work together effectively. But the AI agent then, when they get stuck, might be asking them some questions, some prompting questions to have them re-engage in their interactions. If they seem to be like going down a pathway that seems to be not productive, it might sort of push them back into the right direction. So I think in the sense of group work, this is really, really super powerful. To me personally, I'm really interested in the ways that we can think about AI working with groups of people and not just individuals. Um, I do think there's some potential with individuals as well. I think it requires a lot of work to figure out, how to make it so that it's not shortcutting learning, and instead being helpful. And I think it's also a matter of like where does it fit in an ecosystem then? So is it that I'm just with an AI tutor, or am I doing some activity and an AI tutor is part of that thing? So if I'm working on problems with other people, or if I'm we some colleagues of mine are working on a Python tutor where it's part of an IDE. So I'm doing my coding, I'm doing my project, and I might sort of like go out and sort of like have to ask questions to a tutor. Not that it's just like I go into a place and like it's constantly just me tutoring with with an AI. So it's about contextualizing where the AI has a role, and contextualizing it with other activities. I'm doing another thing right now where an AI tutor is part of a game, a math game.
Mhm.
So, I'm doing my mathematical activities. I'm like doing things within the game, and the AI agent can help provide feedback on what's going on there. So I think this idea that I'm going to sit down in a web browser and engage with a tutor, to me, I feel like that's a passing phase of how we think about AI. I think it's going to be a much more integrated tool that's sort of integrated where it's effective. It'll be integrated into more interesting and student-oriented activities than just sort of like a web browser sort of like I think some things like Conmigo are the typical example of that. Like it's just like here's a tutor, I'm sitting down, I'm asking it questions, and I don't think that's the future of productive AI in pedagogy.
Mhm. So it makes me think a lot because for one of my several class I teach actually now I'm using Google Colab, or my students are using Google Colab, and I had this discussion actually last week. They said, well, in another class we are using just something that is installed on the computer, and you don't have the automation and all these help with code. And initially, I didn't think about using necessarily these tools. I used Google Colab because it's online. You don't need
Yep.
installation. It's good for
Yeah.
collaboration.
Yep. Yep.
But actually, even one student came and said, but I really struggle to write my code, basically my experience as well. So now I'm more and more questioning the use of these tools because it's just too available. But what would you be if you can frame like a so many of my colleagues and myself included who teach a lot and have to evaluate students struggle a bit to rethink the whole way we should help students learn and do evaluation that are useful and cannot be completely substituted and done by AI. So I have some part of answers and things that I do, but I'm really curious about your opinion and if you would have to give advice based on your knowledge on these questions.
Yeah, I mean, what you just said is sort of is exactly what I would say, I think, which is, it's really about thinking about what this is an opportunity for us to think about what do we want our students to learn? What do we want our students to be able to do at the end of our courses? What do we want the outcomes really to be? And then how do we know that they've actually achieved those things? I think, a lot of folks have sort of become accustomed to doing particular kinds of assessments because that's the way we've always done them, and maybe at some point those were really well aligned with our learning goals, but maybe they weren't. And maybe those learning goals have changed in the last 10 or 20 or 30 years. So I think we really need to think about what do we want our students to be able to do? What do we want our students to be able to know at the end of our course? And how will we know that they've done that? And I think if we really ask that question, it may be like, again, like in my course's case, like I didn't care if they learned Fortran. That was not a learning outcome. My learning outcome was like I wanted to make sure that they understood the potential strengths and weaknesses of AI. And so, how did I see that reflected in their final projects that they did? Where in that course it was like I can't remember that was I think it was in the second part of the course it was like moving ahead 10 years and sort of like they had to give like what would a model lesson in a K-12 computer science class be like in 10 years from now, or maybe it was even 5 years from now. It was something not too far from the future. And so that at that point they need to think about like, okay, I've done this thing about AI. how will that play a role in this future class? And I have to project into the future and think about that kind of thing. So that was my assessment there of that activity. So to me, like again, like the AI was really helpful in sort of helping them think about that. I don't think that AI could have helped them do that final activity. That was something that think was purely human. And again, we need to be emphasizing like what are those things that we think are really helpful. Imagine in the Python, if I'm doing stuff in Google Colab and doing statistical analysis, maybe I'm giving a student a problem that they need to solve in real time, in a classroom. Maybe I'm doing things where I've given them 24 hours to do something, but like, they have to coordinate with their peers and sort of like think about data. They don't have the time to sort of like, start from scratch again each time. Maybe it's about them reflecting on what they did in the activity. So it's not just about the output, like here's my code, but like I want you to explain what it did to me and how you would do it in the future in a different way. I think I'm not a big fan of like some people are like, well, we just need to do it. We need to get back to, I don't know if this is universal, but we used to have these little blue books. So when I was in college in the 90s, we would when you would take an exam, you'd sit in a classroom, you'd have this little blue book, and you'd write your essay, in 45 minutes or an hour and a half in the classroom in that little blue book. And some people are like, we need to go back to there because we know that AI is not being used. And I don't feel like that's not an actual task that people have in the rest of their lives. Here's write in 45 minutes in handwriting in a book. Like that's not a useful skill. But I might say like, okay, if the student has written an essay, I might say like, I want to spend 10 minutes with you talking about your essay. Did you understand what you put in it? Did you, can I ask you a what if question about it and you can answer it sensibly? I think you need to be able to own that work. And we need to have ways that students feel like they can and do and must own that work. And to me, that some of that is going to happen through conversation, and that takes time to have a conversation with a student. But in that case, like if you used AI and you still really understood what went into that essay and you can defend it and you can, that's fine from my perspective. If I can produce that code in Google Colab and then you can ask me about it and I can understand what it did and I can tell you how I do it again in a slightly different example, that might be fine. If I write it in Google Colab with Gemini and then you ask me about it, I'm like, I don't know what that variable does.
Yeah.
Then that was not useful. So I think we need to think about ways how we can sort of really have some conversation with people, and maybe AI frees up some of that time so that we can have those conversations with our students. Maybe they can have conversations with each other as part of that to sort of interrogate each other's understanding. I think that human connection is so important in learning, and we need to figure out a way to make that an asset rather than detriment.
So it makes me also think about other examples. Sometimes the evaluation is not something useful in real life, but by giving this type of evaluation, you create, and sorry, but I really like your terminology, but you create the friction. For example, basically, if you have to write this essay in a room 45 minutes, you will try to sit before and learn by heart and try to create those pathways in your brain and create things that you actually learn that will last more than 2 minutes in your brain. And basically, that's also the tension between open book and closed book. You're like, I was initially like, but everything is open book basically in real life. But then, it's also useful to force basically that at one point in time, you learn the full material, and then basically the 10-20% that will remain with you, not everything, in a few months, in a few years, is actually the things you need. But in order to achieve this, you need one way, I guess, and that's just my perspective, is to force learning everything, and then basically it washes out, but you keep the core that is valuable actually. So even if the task sometimes is disconnected from reality,
Huh?
I can imagine some situation when it still helps to build the knowledge.
Yeah, I can imagine those situations. I think it still requires um, constructing that sort of evaluation task in a thoughtful way so that I think you need to be explicit about making that model of like, okay, I it's not about the 45-minute thing that they're doing in class. It's about the preparation that you
Mhm,
do for the 45-minute thing in class.
mhm,
Then that means I need to structure the thing that you're doing for 45 minutes thoughtfully. And I need to give some students some guidance about what they might be doing in advance to sort of be ready for that thing for 45 minutes. Because I think that's the stuff I want to stick with. That what happens in the 45 minutes may not be important. It's the preparation that's important.
true. Um, Maybe let's move to the students. I'm curious about, do you have advice for them? Because again, I have like more than 1,000 young people, different ages, in front of me every year, and sometimes I struggle to know exactly what to tell them and what might make some change to help them learn and use these things efficiently. So, for example, I started to teach how to use these tools. Um, Efficiently where it works, where it doesn't, based on research, and showing, actually, I'm showing you anecdotal example, one of the first thing, and other research that has been done about where it's a positive, negative effect. But what will be your advice for students?
Yeah, I think a couple things. So one is like think about product versus process. I think as I mentioned in the case of vibe coding, like when the product is what matters, like use the tools as much as you can, get to the product. I want to, I'm making a project and the focus is on weather, and just need something to be able to, pull a bunch of weather data for me so I can look at it. Like it may not be that I care about the details of how that happens. I just need the weather data. And like use the tools, like be creative, like be adventurous. Like that might be something that you wouldn't have done before without AI because you're like, that's beyond my capabilities. I couldn't possibly do that. And now I have the capabilities to do that. So in those cases, pull it in. But when the process is what matters, it's about the writing. It's not about the assessment of the writing. It's about the writing itself. It's about the understanding of the code as I go through it because I want to be able to sort of think in the future about how I might sort of structure algorithms. Uh, it's about understanding the mathematics because I'm going to need to apply that mathematics in some way. And in order to really understand how I'm going to apply it, I need to understand how it works.
Mhm,
Um, in some cases, I know that the question you're going to ask me is about the mathematics I just learned, but there's other parts of my life where you're going to ask me mathematics questions, and I'm going to have to draw on math that I've learned over many different years. It's not the obvious connection is not just like the thing you just taught me yesterday. So really understanding mathematics is critical there. So I think in those cases it's the process that matters. It's about going through the process. And in that case, you need to understand like there is no shortcutting that. I have to walk that walk in order to be able to get there. I think that's more generally sort of a misunderstanding, as I mentioned earlier, about the connection between like assessment and learning. And for many students, the assessment feels like it's just the thing that the teacher gives me so that they can differentiate the students in terms of how they're doing in the class. It's not something for me to reflect on my learning or to set a goal so I can have something, as you mentioned about the writing activity. It should be a goal that I'm setting, and I need to figure out how I get to that goal. It's about really recontextualizing what assessment is for students and helping them appreciate that assessments serve a purpose in your learning, not just in sort of differentiating student performance, but in my own learning. And I think that's really critical. And I think the other thing is like it's okay to be uncomfortable sometimes. I think we've kind of gotten to a point where it's like, learning shouldn't be uncomfortable, lots of things shouldn't be uncomfortable, debate shouldn't be uncomfortable. Like these things, it's okay to be uncomfortable sometimes. I think and the uncomfortable and sort of unsafe are different things. And so I think like being stuck on a problem and like persevering through it is a good thing. It's not about like I'm stuck, I just need the answer to this thing. Sometimes sort of dwelling on that for a little while is important to be able to figure it out on your own so that like now I've made the connections in my own head about how to solve this problem. And I've learned that at a much deeper level than if you just told me the answer to that problem. And I think just sort of like being able to sit there for a while with a little bit of uncomfortableness about not knowing is actually really helpful. And that's a skill I think that we maybe have lost in teaching our students. And I think we need to figure out a way to sort of help them appreciate that, not just
mhm,
tolerate it, but appreciate it, that it's okay to do that.
mhm.
I'll say that like when I was in college, I remember one of my a friend of a friend used to say like when we were going to take tests, they would say, "Let's go celebrate our knowledge." And I really think that like, that's how we should feel about it. They were sarcastic at the time, even, but the but the idea is like we should think about assessment as like this is a useful experience for me. This is
Mhm.
helpful in me helping understand like if I'm either celebrating like I've understood this, or if I didn't, like it helps me reflect on what I didn't understand so that I can really move forward more effectively. And again, that's got to be a dialogue. It can't just be implicit like, yeah, that test was just to help you reflect. I think it has to be really explicit about that from faculty and teachers to their students.
Mhm. So I really remember also it's funny what you said about tests, but during my bachelor, mainly my bachelor years, where it was really like a sport competition for me. I was before the exam drinking caffeine. I was spent countless hours in the library listening to the Last Mohican music before going
Yep.
in the auditorium. You know, like really pumped
Yeah.
to
Yeah,
exactly
definitely. I
live
remember
it
listening
like
to the music
this.
on the way to class. Yep. Went to the final exam. Yep.
Exactly. And I really like this allowing for being uncomfortable in class. And that's something actually I try to replicate in many courses that I give with smaller classes, because I have some classes with 800 students, another with 450, but I have smaller classes when it's like 40, 20. We really do also with colleagues jointly projects that looks and simulate real work or research projects,
Hmm.
um, where you have uncertainty and where I don't have the answer. I have answer about the methodology, but I don't know the result of the research because they are doing the research. And often, if we are two giving the class, we can debate and disagree on the solution and the pathway. And while I think this is sometimes surprising for the students, but I think indeed it's basically what happens then in real life. You don't have the answer to the multiple choice question. You have to face this uncertainty and
Yes.
make the step. The more you getting senior, the more you're like, okay, I'll have to make this step, accept uncertainty and see what will happen and stand with this, but also accept if it didn't work
Yep.
and experiencing this, I think, because my personal experience was then going to work. That was something I had to discover a lot. Before you feel you always have the answer, you can get the answer, but actually it doesn't work like this. And I think replicating this in class when possible is indeed a very rich experience.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Once we leave the classroom, there are a few problems that we know that we have the right answer.
Mhm.
We have to trust we have the right answer, or a good answer, and building our skills and sort of accepting that and owning that, I think, are really important.
Do you use Perplexity.ai or know the tool? It's
I have used it, but I don't use it regularly. No.
okay. Because I'm also curious with this this the way again the friction example and because here basically it reduces also the friction. Basically, instead of going through Google and you
Yep.
question each links, right? At least you should do this. You check the source and you're like, should I
Yeah.
want to open this BBC link or I don't, or and this one, and then you start skimming through the paper or the web page. The other thing give you the answer. That's the whole goal of an answer engine. But that's the first time I was actually quite enthusiastic about answer engine and Perplexity in particular. But while discussing with you, I perfectly see this concept of actually wrestling with the search results is beneficial.
We uh post COVID, we don't do this as much anymore, but basically in my lab for many years, every day a bunch of people would sit together and eat lunch.
Mhm.
And we had a very strict rule at lunch, which was the one Google rule. You could
Oh,
only Google something once at lunch. because because sometimes like just having like the discussion around like, well, what are the number of people in the country who can speak more than three languages. Like sometimes it's useful to think through that, like not to just look it up. A lot of them were kind of what we might call Fermi problems, like that people might think about. But other times it was just like, who was in that movie? And you start to talk about, well, I remember it being this person who was in this other movie, but I can't remember their name. And like just even that discussion is important to sort of like go through that thought process. There were many really interesting discussions that sort of resulted because people weren't like Googling the answer to everything, and it also meant that people weren't on their phones, sort of like absorbed in their phones as well. There was more person-to-person interaction. But I think those kinds of conversations, those kinds of discussions where you're thinking through the information and not just sort of looking it up, is I think really helpful. And I think perplexity takes that sort of one step even further. I'm now not even finding the primary sources. I'm like looking at some synthesis of it. And again, I haven't used perplexity as much. I do sometimes see that Google now does this itself, where it will summarize answers with AI. And I'd say like 50-50, it's right versus wrong. I often look up things like like quantitative information, and like that number was somewhere in the article. Like it gives me a number for something, and that
Mhm.
number was somewhere in an article, but it wasn't about the thing that I was asking for. It's like um I don't know, like again, like the number of people that speak three languages, and there was an article about that, but um it told me that it was 90%, but it was like that 90% was referring to people who can speak two languages, and it was not the people who can speak three languages. It just sort of like got the number wrong. And I think it's going to be very easy for people to just sort of take that answer at face value rather than going to the source and then even evaluating that source, right? Like even if it points me at something which is a source, I need to know, like, do I trust that source? Does that source have it right? Does that source get it from a proper place? And is it reliable? And I think the more we remove ourselves from that process of sort of having to understand that, I think the more likely we are to believe things that aren't true. And I think that's a huge problem in the world today.
Mhm. And it gives a sense of truth. I mean, at least
Yeah.
many people. I remember really vividly a student that I have. He was also, I think, a TA at some point. Very smart person. And at the very beginning, I was so shocked because he told me like with ChatGPT 3.5, so it's quite basic compared to what we have today. And he was telling me, well, now I don't even go on Google. I ask everything to 3.5. And I was really shocked. Like, it's so far. You don't even have a source. It's not made for this. It was
Right.
very subject to hallucination. Many things were wrong. And now I think with something like Perplexity, it gives this sense of truth because indeed you have varied sources, so you can say, well, it's more diverse, which I doubt, but I think you sometimes because it's out of a computer, some people are misled thinking it's the truth, like a
Right.
calculator who give you a correct answer. But here we're dealing with human knowledge and interpretation, and even if transformers attention is very incredible tools, I mean, it's far from just even for humans assessing what is the truth is very hard. I remember
Yep.
or moderating a panel on misinformation, and we actually spent the whole discussion trying to figure out what is the truth, and just defining and debating on actually when can we say that it's the truth? Do we have multiple truths? And it was fascinating. It was fascinating just to see this. Um, I wanted to ask you also because I've seen some research to also use Gen AI to reduce inequality, but some other people would suggest that it might increase inequality. So increase inequality because some people who maybe have a higher socioeconomic status can have the cutting edge tools, pay 200 per month for ChatGPT Pro, can have a powerful computer, whatever, all these resources and are more maybe fluent on average with or fluent with computers. I'm not sure how to say this, but able to use computers. So on this side, might create asymmetries. While in other contexts, it might also help to reduce asymmetries. Help when in some places you have lower educational resources, lower a higher number of students per teacher or things like this. There have been an experiment by the World Bank in Kenya, I think, but they didn't publish yet the paper, but they will. And there was some promising examples that using AI to support the teacher, but it was always jointly used. And again, as a tutor, seemed that it could be helpful also to reduce inequality. So what's your view on this?
I think they're both true. I think there's a potential, and we may see them both happening simultaneously, a potential
Yeah.
for both increasing and decreasing equality. I think a lot of it depends on how it's used, and what we wind up valuing. I definitely I think the risk of increasing inequality is greater than the probability of decreasing inequality, but I think there's a potential for to still decrease. I think that the reason why I think there's a potential to increase inequality is, as you said, like access to the best tools. But the second and perhaps more important is like as we were just describing it, like um, using it well requires a whole bunch of training. So if I want to be smart about how I use AI, and I want to learn new things and I want to learn them effectively, like that requires a whole set of pre-training. Um, and that pre-training is typically associated with the people who are already privileged, who are already sort of have good educational access, who already have good resources. We saw that happen with MOOCs, 10 years ago or 12 years ago or whatever it was. Um, it was the idea was we're going to democratize education by putting all these things online and people will have access to them. But the people who end up getting a master's degree were the people who already had a master's degree
Mhm.
because they knew how to learn. They knew how to have like they knew how to like go online and sort of structure their learning and set goals and do all those things. I think we could definitely see even more of that with AI, where the people who already have access and already sort of have a well-founded education are sort of just moving even further. Um, and so, but I do think that there's opportunities to be able to provide, there's some studies that are emerging, like, okay, like we're supporting teachers, we're giving students individualized tutoring, I think the jury is still out on like what are the long-term effects of that. Like it's one thing to say like I tutored students for like 6 weeks in math, and like on the other side, the students who have the AI do better, but how about 6 weeks later than that? How about 6 months later than that? What happens to those students over the long run? Did they really learn it, or are they just sort of like being able to sort of like you know perform the simple tasks that the AI was asking them to do? I think one potential risk, even in sort of like even with an attempt to sort of decrease that inequality, is the potential for creating a two-tiered system, where we say like, okay, the people who have money get real teachers and real mentors and real tutors and get access to all that stuff, and like, well, giving the other people sort of AI is better than nothing. And like we can help them with AI. So we're gonna just like we're not even gonna try to get them teachers or students or mentors or peers. We're just gonna give them AI and say that's good enough. And I think if we get into a situation where we're saying AI is good enough and they don't need real people in their lives, I think that's a risk as well. Even if it's helping them learn some things, as we just were discussing, like learning the math, learning the language, that's a small portion of what you need to learn to be successful in life. You need to learn how to persevere. You need to learn how to interact with other people. You need to learn how to like be uncomfortable with not knowing things. Like these are things that you don't learn necessarily with just sort of sitting with an AI. You learn them interacting with other people. And so I want to make sure that even in our attempts to decrease that inequality, that we make sure that we understand that the AI is part of a larger system that is so dependent on person-to-person interaction as a part of learning, that we don't try to replace that, or substitute AI for that in cases where we feel like those students just can't afford to have people doing that.
Mhm. Yeah, it seems in different situation also like call centers, like and basically getting help that it's really human becomes like a luxury service or
Yes.
good. It's
Yes.
like you substitute everything, but the luxury is really having the professor coming here. You
Yes.
can you can watch Ethan Molik the MOOC, but having him come in place is a different deal, and
Yes.
it's monetized differently as well. So it's I think it's also very A bit sad. I would say it's beneficial, but I mean the fact that this human interaction can be seen as luxury good in one way, you could perceive it as a let's celebrate, but in another way, it shows also that we tend to replace it with technology
Yes.
at a quite fast pace. Maybe have one last question, concluding question. Are you more cautious or hopeful about the future given the pace at which it's changing, right? 2022, 30th of November, ChatGPT 3.5. Now you have, I can't even count them, but reasoning models, all those things, and it sounds crazy.
I, I'd say I'm excited about the future, but I'm also cautious about the future. I do think there's great potential for a lot of these tools. I'm one of the people like, where are we on the AI curve, right?
Mhm.
Like, are we on this part of the curve? Are we going up, and it's accelerating at this point, or have we already sort of like, have we passed the inflection point and we're sort of like leveling off? I'm in the past the inflection point group. If I look at what's happened in the AI world over the last 6 months or year, like things are definitely getting better and cheaper, but like it's not 3.5 to 4. We see things that are getting better. We see things that are, and I think there's reasons for that, which is that all the information is already in there, right? So once all the information is already in there, like you will slow down. So I do think we'll see a slowing pace. It's not to say that we're not going to see increases, but I don't think they're going to be at the pace that we've currently seen them, at least until we get to the next inflection point, where something else happens. Um, but that's fine. I think incremental improvement is the place where we can actually be thoughtful about making those change, like how we're using this. When things are moving really quickly, it's very hard to be thoughtful about how to adapt to that because like by the time I've thought about that and made the change, like everything's moved on. I do think now we're at a place where we can actually be really thoughtful about how we're using these systems, about thinking about the applications as opposed to just like get everybody on ChatGPT. Like now we have to think about like what are they doing when they're there and what kind of ChatGPT they're interacting with. I think we can think about all those things and think about how to use that effectively. And again, I want to get back to like it's not just about like human and chatbot, but about human, chatbot, maybe other humans, activity, like thinking about what does that whole space look like with when AI is a part of it and not just sort of like a human chatbot interaction. I think we're at a point where we could be focusing on those things, and to me, that's exciting. And I think that's where we'll see sort of positive and interesting change. We'll see benefits to people. If we're constantly just chasing the technology, I think we'll see the divide increase. We'll see people shortcutting learning. We'll see people using AI as a crutch as opposed to a really productive helper. So I think we're going to get to a point where we can actually be productive about the uses of it, and I think we're almost there, or we're there maybe now. But I still have that caution that I see all these time like everybody's gonna have a professor in their pocket, that kind of thing. Like I think we shouldn't be you know you know techno fantasizing about like how the technology is going to solve all of our problems. We really need to be thoughtful about how we're using it.